Welcome to the Black Sparrow Media Internet Broadcast Network.
You are listening to Linux in the Ham Shack. LHS is a podcast about Linux, open source, and amateur radio, for everyone. Now here are your hosts, Cheryl, W5MOO, Russ, K5TUX, and Bill, NE4RD.
Well, hello everybody and welcome. You have tuned into episode number 543 of Linux in the Ham Shack, the most terrific amateur radio podcast on the internet. Tonight is our deep dive episode, and our deep dive episode was supposed to be one topic, but that topic fell through. So Bill, in his infinite wisdom, said, hey, we've had retro gaming on tap forever and ever. Why don't you talk about that? Plus, I'm ripped, so I don't want to say anything tonight. So I guess I'm going to do a little deep dive on retro gaming. And before we do that, we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves. For the on assignment, Cheryl, I'm Russ, W5. Yeah, no, she's W5MOO. I'm K5TUX.
Wait, who's ripped? And this is Bill, NE4RD.
Yeah, I think we all know the answer to that question. So now I kind of wish I was too, but oh well. Anyway, so hopefully the peanut gallery here doesn't clear out because we're not talking about an amateur radio topic tonight. It is technically an open source topic because I believe all of the retro gaming solutions that I'm going to talk about are open source, both hardware and software in most cases. Although I haven't done proper due diligence to find out about the hardware really. But so brief introduction to retro gaming on Linux specifically. I'm a big retro gamer, not a current gamer. I have an Xbox and stuff like that, but I'm not really into the modern games. I'm into the old ones. And to that end, I have built several systems, arcade style systems in stand-up cabinets that use emulation software and Linux to provide retro gaming access for me and anybody else who wants to use them when they're here.
I think you need to qualify like which cabinets.
Qualify which cabinets? I'm just talking about like if you went into an arcade in the 80s and you saw an upright cabinet,
but you don't have cabinets that are specifically from like eBay. You have some older cabinets that are like sort of more retro than like buying a rebuilt cabinet for Galaga, let's say, from the 70s.
Oh, yeah. I mean, specifically, I have found people online, like using Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or whatever, that I have actual authentic like games from the 70s and 80s that I have that are for the most part were non-working. And I pulled out all the insides and rebuilt them as multicade machines. So they are real arcade machines that I've, rebuilt and repurposed. So I assume that's what you're getting at.
Yeah. It's like, I'm not sure, like a lot of people can buy those sort of semi-retro games from, let's say Costco or, some other modern marketplace that are, these are sort of today's version of, let's say, Mario, whatever, race kart or whatever. And they're not necessarily the actual physical consoles that we actually went into the games and dropped quarters in to play like Galaga and Moonraker and all the various games that you can play via quarters in the old arcades where you've actually retrofitted an existing console, which is I think more interesting.
Okay, well I think it's interesting too. That's why I do it. So I bought one machine that was an old Kangaroo machine, which was a game in the 80s. And then I bought one that was a Galaga 3, which was a game from the later 80s. I think that one came out in like 86, something like that. And then I have one that is a little newer because it was designed as a multi-arcade game, but I still took all of the guts out of it and redid it. So yeah, I do have the classic cabinets. They're all upright. I also have one of the new ones that you're talking about, the ones you can pick up at like Walmart and Costco, called the One-Ups. But I did the same thing with that one. I actually like 3D printed parts for it and ripped out all the internals and took out the games that were in it and turned it into another multi-cade machine. But I will get to all of that. So
Russ really thinks this is not interesting, but I think this is very interesting because he's even gone to the fact that he needs to get specific hardware for specific like joggers, the roller balls, and the buttons and everything else. And I think that's very, very interesting in the fact that you're trying to rebuild an arcade machine that does not exist anymore except for in a museum.
Yeah, generally speaking, although there has been, at least from my perusal of YouTube, kind of a resurgence of people building actual retro arcades where they're going way deeper into this than I am. I'm using, Raspberry Pis and leveraging modern computer architectures and modern operating systems, but there's a few guys on YouTube who are rebuilding arcades by going and buying these legacy machines and actually refurbishing them the way they used to be by like rebuilding the cabinets with, resin and paint and T-molding and replacing all the caps on the CGA CRTs and doing the whole thing so that they're actually the original machines when they're done. I am not doing that.
But you are like getting hardware to work with, like RetroArch or whatever version of the old emulators, so you can, because I know you've like gone through like trying to get the buttons just right and getting the right buttons, and I think that's like if you're building these retro cabinets and doing it yourself, even with a Raspberry Pi and stuff like that, it still takes a little bit of finesse and picking the right hardware, the right controllers, and dealing with those nuances that you've had to deal with specifically, because like you've had to go through a lot of headaches, because I know I've heard you talking about like, this button didn't work or whatever, and this controller didn't work. I had to, work around with this GPIO settings and stuff like that. I think a lot of people are kind of, especially in our audience, are interested in that are from that era of like, we used to go to the arcade, play Gauntlet, play, Moonraker, play, all these various video games via quarters or loonies or whatever you have. And are interested in rebuilding that kind of that thing. And then, we also have this, which I know we're going to get to, is the R36S that you just recently bought. So don't discount anything that you have to say. I mean, you're kind of devaluing everything you say, and it's like, it's not devalued at all. I think this is really important.
All right. Well, let me get through the easy stuff first before I get into all of the components and pieces for building like a real retro machine. But if you're not wanting to go through all of that trouble and you just want to play retro games, there's some easier ways to do it. You can have a Retro Pi system or a Recall Box system just running on a Raspberry Pi connected to your HDI monitor, and you'll be good to go with that. You'll probably want to get controllers and stuff, and I'm going to talk about the different ways you can do controllers later. But you can also use a keyboard. Some games are playable just using a keyboard, and so you can kind of have the experience by just putting it on a Raspberry Pi or another single board computer or even on a desktop. There's Laka Linux and Batacera Linux, which are both dedicated to retro gaming on like AMD 64 hardware. And then, of course, the Recall Box and the Retro Pis are designed for the ARM hardware and the Raspberry Pis. Retro Pi can even run, like on Raspberry Pi 2s or even, I think, zeros, depending on the emulators you want to use. So you don't have to throw much in the way of hardware at it if you just want to get this done. But if you want to go a little deeper and kind of, go the route that I have been going, where you're actually turning these upright cabinets into arcade machines, then there's more work to be done. You can, in all of my builds, and as I said, I've done 3 of them so far, and I've got a 4th one in the works. I started with a Raspberry Pi. Now, I've used Raspberry Pi 3s and 4s. Those seem to be the easiest, and they handle the emulators really well. And then what I've done is you have to interface, with a cabinet. So the old cabinets, they come out of the 70s and 80s, and so they don't have HDMI monitors or anything like that. They have old CRTs. Sometimes they're, mounted vertically depending on the game. Sometimes they're mounted horizontally. Sometimes they're more of a straight up larger 4x3 aspect depending on what was being played on them. But you can, if you're really into this kind of thing, they have HDMI to CGA converters so that you can actually plug Raspberry Pi's HDMI output into one of these old CGA monitors. The problem with the old CGA monitors is most of them don't work. A lot of them have burn-in. And if you want to make them work again, you've got to do some actual soldering work. You've got to pull caps. You've got to go through the flyback and de-energize these boards, make sure all the traces are good, make sure there's no cold solders, stuff like that. And that was a route I didn't really want to go down. I considered it at first, but most of the machines I bought had like really crappy CRTs in them. And so what I wound up doing is just using LCD monitors that support either HDMI directly or by using an HDMI to VGA converter. That works pretty well, especially if you have a large enough monitor to handle the games that have vertical orientation or horizontal. But one thing you have to do when you do that is you have to pull out the old CRT and then figure out a way to mount a modern LCD monitor in it. So you're going to actually have to do some construction work, which I have done. And one thing that was important for me was I have one machine where the screen is almost vertical, and then I have another one where the screen is almost horizontal. It's almost laying flat. And in that case, if you're gonna use the one that's laying almost flat, you have to mount the monitor upside down and do the 180 degree rotation on the video, because if you don't, then you're essentially looking at the monitor from the bottom. And if you're, the way LCD monitors work, they have sort of a polarization. So depending on like your angle of view, the screen can look almost black, particularly from the bottom. If you're looking at it from the top, it's usually okay. So in that case, that's why I had to mount that particular one upside down. But it worked well that way. And of course, once you set the Raspberry Pi to boot up in the 180 degree rotated orientation, it's irrelevant that the monitor is upside down.
I think we kind of broke your train of thought.
Probably.
Because you're already into hardware. We haven't even really talked about software yet. And
well, the software, like I said, okay, yeah. So I was talking about the Linuxes for AMDs, Lacon and Batacera, and these are basically just all the it's like built as a kiosk. Everything's rolled into one. The emulators are there. The interface is there. You literally just boot them up and you can play retro games on them.
So if I was running, let's say, Ubuntu, what package would I use to start thinking about running these old games?
As far as I know, you need sort of 3 parts. You need RetroPie, you need RetroArch, and you need Emulation Station. Those are the 3 pieces.
And let's be clear, you do not need a Pi for this. You
do not need a Pi. Yeah.
RetroPie is just specific to the Pi architecture.
Yes. And that's because that's where I was focused. That's what I used pretty much primarily, but all of these other ones will work fine just in a PC environment. So
right, because you're using it and rebuilding a cabinet, and that's a very specific architecture.
Well, it's literally an architecture, yeah, because it's a built piece of furniture. Yeah, so it requires some actual architecture.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, the standalone ones have all of those pieces built in. You can assemble them by yourself. But for the most part, from what I've seen, if you're going to be doing this retro gaming thing and setting up a multicade, then you kind of want one of these that's pre-done. You don't really want to build it yourself. because it's more than likely that the machine that you're going to be doing this on is not really going to do anything else. That's kind of how I see it. I mean, you could have your Shack PC play retro games too. I can't say I haven't done that because I have. But once you get, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, let's just talk about some of the packages that you would need if you wanted to do that for software wise. So like, let's say you have some bins or some binaries, or you've acquired some game console files that you want to run. Things like we talked about RetroPie, which is an actual software application. It's not necessarily an architecture application, but it is specific for the Pi. But there's RetroArch, and there's also things like RecalBox, ArcOS, Bacatera Linux. There's Dolphin, which I didn't see in the notes, but Dolphin is also an emulator as well. There's very, very many emulators for handling various binary packages from these arcade systems. And these arcade systems can be anything from like what people from, let's say, Gen X that would know that, like, you know, they played arcade games, Gauntlet, Moonraker, so on and so forth. But there's also Genesis, Super Nintendo 64, GameCube, Dreamcast, many systems, Atari systems, Atari, ColecoVision, and very many others that have various emulators that are out there for that are actually available on Linux that you've listed here, like I don't even know how to say that, Laka.
Probably
Linux.
Laka, yeah.
Laka Linux, Dolphin, Bacatera, ArcOS, RetroPie, RetroArch, RecalBox. So these are all emulation environments for emulating these environments for systems that are not necessarily like 64-bit systems, but most likely like 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit systems that you may have seen in an arcade or in an arcade fashion or in a game console. And that's sort of like this whole premise, is that this retro gaming is not necessarily just stuff you would have seen inside of an arcade, but also inside of a console. So like, think about console games prior to, you know, what we have now, which is what, Xbox X and, you know, what, PS6 or something like that, PlayStation 6.
I don't keep up with the PlayStation, but yeah. The modern stuff, this is obviously not for that. I will specify that, or I will clarify rather, that the emulators are sort of a subset of what we've been talking about. Like, for example, the Atari 2600 emulator is called Stella. The retro arcade game emulator is called MAME, and there are different emulators. A lot of them are built on what's called LibRetro, which is a library of engines for emulating different systems, whether they be consoles or arcade games. And then things like Laka Linux and Emulation Station and RetroPie, they aggregate all of those emulators into a nice, easy to use user interface. And in a lot of cases, particularly like RetroPie, you can use the interface and interface with your Raspberry Pi without having a keyboard. You can do it using your arcade buttons, and it simplifies, you know, configuration and stuff like that using that. Now, it's still handy to have a keyboard sometimes, but you can usually manage your entire retro system just using retro buttons and joysticks and things like that. And that's what Emulation Station and RetroPie and stuff are for, is to aggregate and prettify all of the myriad different emulators that exist. And I'm not going down to the level of the different emulators because there are way too many. But yeah, so that's the basic idea of the systems. I'm going to have a link to all of the different systems in the show notes. So if you want to see at what level each of these things exists at, like whether it's an operating system or a kiosk system or a UI aggregator or an emulator or anything like that, you'll be able to go to the link and see sort of where it fits in the retro gaming arena. But before we get much more bogged down in that, we should probably move on to hardware. Because like I said, so once you have a system, once you've chosen whether you're going to use a single board computer or a system on a chip like a rock chip, which is what the R36S is, and we'll get to what that is in a second, or you're just using a PC, then, of course, if you want to have the real experience of an arcade machine, particularly a retro machine, you're going to need controls. You're going to either need like a joystick and buttons or a trackball or a spinner or something like that, depending on what games you're playing. And in some cases, if you're using like a console emulator, like if you want to play your PlayStation 1 games or your Nintendo 64 games or something like that, you might want to actually have a controller like what those consoles used to use. You can get those. There are now all of the software and all the operating systems we've talked about have layers in them with drivers to turn modern equivalents of the old console controllers into either wired or Bluetooth or USB dongle versions of them. So like if you wanted to play Mario Kart from the N64, you can get an N64 controller that's Bluetooth. You can sync that up with your retro system, and then it'll be just like playing an N64, even though you don't actually have an N64. And those are available in all varieties, like for the Nintendo Entertainment System, for PlayStations, for Segas, for, whatever it is. And then there's a company called 8-Bit Do. A link, of course, will be in the show notes, that has all different kinds of things. They actually have like little things that sit on your desk that emulate the joystick and buttons from an old arcade machine, all the way up to multifunction controllers that can emulate every kind of console, from Xbox to PlayStation to Game Gear to, whatever. And they're actually pretty reasonably priced, and they make your gameplay work really well. And they can even be used to play the old arcade games, too. You kind of have to get used to the idea that you're, playing Missile Command or whatever on using a Nintendo controller. But these are things you can do. And the software actually makes it really easy to do these integrations. Oh, yeah, I mentioned in here the one-ups. So in the world today, Bill kind of mentioned this in passing earlier, you can go to like Costco and Walmart, and they have these like half-scale arcade machines that will have maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 games on them, like Galaga, Miss Pac-Man, or Joust and something else. And you can buy those for, I don't know, a couple $100, $300, something like that. And they come with a monitor and a little thing, and it's almost like a kid's toy. But when you rip those apart, like I have done, inside is, actual arcade buttons, joysticks, controllers, an LCD monitor, power supply, and all that kind of stuff. So it's really easy to convert those with like a Raspberry Pi into a retro gaming arcade console. And I have done that with one, and it was minimal cost. I think I bought the one up for like $100, and then I put another $100 into it, and now I can play every console and arcade game in the world on that one up machine. So that's pretty cool. Let's see, we talked about Raspberry Pis, rock chips. Of course, your interfaces, like I said, you can have the arcade style buttons that like 8-Bit Go does, or 8-Bit Do, not 8-Bit Go. You can just use a keyboard. You can just map keyboards, like your A key presses the fire button, your B key does the bomb, whatever. And then if you want to build stuff like I've been building, you're going to need some interfaces. So upright arcade games in the past had like speakers in them, but you can't really drive a speaker from the cabinet using a Raspberry Pi. They're just not powerful enough to drive the big old speakers and stuff like that. So if you want sound, you have to get like an external audio amplifier. If you want, more buttons than your arcade console came with, you'll have to buy buttons. You'll have to get joysticks. And then, of course, there's wiring all this stuff up. And it's literally hard wiring. What's nice about it is they've created interface kits that have USB boards. You plug the board into a USB port on the Raspberry Pi, and then it breaks that board out into the actual contacts that you need to plug up to your buttons, your trackballs, your spinners, what have you. And that's made really simple as well. You can get the stuff on Amazon. I'm going to have links to like all the stuff I've bought to do this. So you can put in new joysticks, put in new buttons, put in new spinners, put in new trackballs, and interface them all with a RetroPie. And they're not even particularly expensive. 30, $40 gets you a couple of joysticks and a whole bunch of buttons. And then you get the pleasure of putting your kit together and making it all work. They're, like I said before, they're also video interface kits, so that if you actually want to use retro monitors, you can. You can connect your HDMI or VGA outs to CGA and stuff like that. So the hardware exists to basically do this however you want to do it. If you want to be a little more modern like I do, you can do it that way. If you actually want to install the old hardware and use all the original buttons and stuff like that, you can certainly do that as well. Sound exists. I think the amplifiers I bought cost like, I don't know, $6 or $7 or something like that. And you can just plug them into the headphone jack on a Raspberry Pi, and it will power the game's original speakers. You can get there's a company called Hap Controls, and they provide like amusement type stuff for like everything, including like the 5.2 volt power supplies that will actually provide like 12 volt, 120 volt, and 5.2 volt, so that you can power like your coin slot lights and your overhead marquee light and stuff like that, and the Raspberry Pi and stuff like that, which is kind of cool. And if you get the right arcade machines from the past, they actually have those in them, so you could even power your Pi off the original power supply. So I know I'm wandering.
No, that's good. Like, how complicated? Like, let's say a game, like let's say Centipede, and you want to get that trackball working. Like, how much of an accomplishment is it to get the trackball integrated, bought, and configured?
Well, if you have to do any physical modification of the machine, for example, if you bought something that didn't originally have a trackball in it, it can be a little difficult. You're going to have like a step drill bits or a hole saw or something like that to actually create a spot to put the trackball. But once you've done that, the part about hooking it up is really pretty simple. You just buy those USB interface boards, and you just put the 4 axes. You literally connect the 8 wires for the 4 axes onto the board, and then you tell RetroArch that this controller controls, the X1, the X2, the Y1, and the Y2. And then it will understand that for the rest for whatever games use it. So other than, making a few physical connections and creating a space for whatever controls you need, whether it's a joystick or a trackball or a spinner or whatever, the retro game software actually makes integrating those relatively simple. So it's really well documented. So, I mean, you're only looking at a few minutes of setup to implement a control. Oh, did we lose you?
No. I was relighting my cigar. Okay.
I gotcha. Oh, I'm looking at Steve here.
I was wondering, like, how complicated, like, say you have the physical connection, and you say that's via USB, that you're, like, basically into a USB header, I'm assuming.
Yes.
For the trackball, and this sort of comes as a kit from the various Amazon links that you provided.
That is correct, yes.
And so when you're in RetroArch, like, how complicated is that for the end user to actually configure once they have the let's say the trackball wired?
Usually it's just a matter of going into you probably need a keyboard connected to the system just so you have access to it. But generally it's as simple as going into the configuration by hitting the tab key, and then you scroll down through the options. It'll say like button 1, button 2, button 3, button 4, trackball X, trackball X2, stuff like that. So what happens is you go down through, and when it says, button 1, whatever button you want to be button 1, you press that button, and that becomes button 1. Whatever button you want to be button 2, you press that button, it becomes button 2. When you get down to the trackball settings, you just move the trackball in the direction that, it says to be, like X1 or X plus. When you set the X minus, you just move the trackball as X minus, and so on, and that's what configures it. It just literally doing the thing you want the thing to do is what the configuration involves.
No, it's pretty intuitive in the configuration because I've never used actually the software. So like that's kind of important, I guess, for users if they're building their own system to understand that the software provides a configuration utility for these attachments that allows you to, say, okay, if I move the ball to the left, this is X minus. If I move the ball to the right, this is X plus, and up whatever Y plus, and then down Y minus.
Yeah, and actually, if you take a RetroPie system and plug a controller into it, like one of these USB interfaces, it will just pop up a wizard and say, "We need to configure. We've detected a controller. We need to configure a controller," and it'll say, this is button A. What button is button A? So you press button A. What button is button B? So you press button B, and you just go down through the list, and it configures the interface for you. So it basically just steps you through the process.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I've never used a system like that, so that's kind of interesting. Yeah, I've only had the experience with retro stuff with the little tiny console, the little R36S that I've gotten.
Yeah, and the R36S actually works the exact same way. The only thing is you didn't have to do the step where you configured the various buttons. It's already done for you when you get the system. They did that step for you, so that like your 4 triggers on the back and your ABXY and your left right analog pad and left right digital pad and stuff like that. It's already set to what it's supposed to be. And then what you have to do is hope the games that you're playing actually line up with the pre-configured settings. I do believe there is some ability to modify what buttons are associated with what functions, but I haven't really explored that on the R36S yet. So for those people who are clueless about this thing, the R36S that we're talking about, it came up a couple of shows ago. Bill said he had a retro handheld. It's basically the size of like a Game Boy, but it's built on a rock chip, and it has ArcOS on it, and then it has the RetroPie and emulation station and everything built on top of that. And it comes pre-configured, and it has, if I remember correctly, a little over 15,000 different games on it from, I think, about 20 different consoles. And,
yes.
And it comes that way with everything pre-installed. You basically just boot the thing up. It looks like it's like a 4-inch TFT screen. It looks like a computer booting up, and then it gives you a nice user interface. And then you just have access to a whole bunch of retro games. You've got Sega, you've got MAME, you've got Capcom, NES, SNES, and there's a whole bunch more. And you can play those all in this little handheld that's, like I said, about slightly bigger than a Game Boy, which is really cool. And that shows you how well it can be sort of put together and just done as an all-in-one that just gets shipped to you. And those was like, what, $38, something like that for that thing?
Yeah, something like that through AliExpress. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can do that if you want to do these with like absolute minimal effort. That is certainly the way to go. It's not always the best because it lacks some controllers. Like if you're like me and you love games like Tempest that require a spinner, the game is basically impossible to play on it because it doesn't have the proper controls. Anything that uses a trackball like Millipede and Centipede and Missile Command, stuff like that, also impossible because all you have is the axes. You don't have a trackball. But for most things, it plays just fine. I even discovered a game that was on there that I used to love that I completely forgot about called Phoenix. And I actually went and installed that on all the other machines that I have here today because I completely forgot about it and I hadn't installed it. So I went and did that, and I've been playing Phoenix most of the day. So that's pretty cool. Let's see. So the other stuff like RetroPie and Laka Linux and all those basically take that little handheld thing and blow it up to either like a desktop environment or a Raspberry Pi, or if you want to do like I do, just build cabinets and create actual stand-up arcade machines. Not sure what else I need to go into here.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the R36S, because I think it's like the most accessible way to see all of this stuff in actual, let's say, production. Like if it was a production environment and you're not a guy that can or a person that could build a console or take a one up and retrofit it to doing the RetroPie or the ArcOS or something like that. let's talk a little bit about utilizing the R36S and how that actually fits into the puzzle of stuff.
Well, I think the R36S is nice. This will actually be good because I can talk about the R36S and then get into the last topic I have, which is legality. So the R36S is really nice because it does encapsulate all of these different things into one well done pre-configured package, so that it's literally just you boot it up and you start playing games. You don't have to do anything special, and it kind of gives you the feel for what a more complicated retro arcade setup would be like without all the hassle. And because it's all in all-in-one and all the buttons and different control pads and stuff are included, it is by far the easiest way to get into it. And as long as you don't mind, searching for it on the Chinese, websites, you can have yours for $40, and I think it takes a week and a half or whatever to ship. They're actually pretty good about getting them to you. And the system is good. It comes built in with USB-C ports and an SD card slot, so you can add games to it if it doesn't have the ones you want. It has a rechargeable battery built into it, so that's really nice. The UI is configurable using the buttons on the system, so you don't have to worry about having a keyboard. And overall, it's pretty slick. And if you like this kind of gaming and you want to get into it, I mean, you should definitely pick up an R36S. Was there something else you were thinking of on that?
No, it's just I was waiting to hear you talk about the amazing screen.
Oh, yeah, because we had that story about it, and then they kept saying that it's a surprisingly good screen. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you recently bought an R36S. I've had mine for probably a month now, and beyond the quirks, there are some quirks to it that I think if an owner actually buys one and sees it, you may or may not see the various emulators that are actually there, depending upon which time you boot. And I think that's very odd, but it's kind of one of those things that you kind of come to expect with a system that is slightly, let's say, less than legal to own, because there's so many binaries and stuff like that for games that probably have some commercial requirements of being on the system that they're on. Let's say GBA or Game Boy Duo or Dreamcast. Well, Dreamcast is probably not so important these days, but I would assume like the Game Boy Advanced and Game Boy Duo. What's the Duo? Is it Duo? Game Boy Duo?
Game Gear Duo?
DS?
The Nintendo DS.
Nintendo DS, yeah. And there's mine, there's 16 games that are for Nintendo DS that are on there. But you don't always see those if you're actually flipping through the games on side of the R36S. But I think it's an interesting platform for being able to sort of nudge your way into this retro gaming environment should you not want to create your own console like you have, which I think is really awesome, because you can your stuff that you've been working on is actually stand-up consoles. And I think a lot of people maybe don't get that. It's these are literal games you stand up in front of, very much like a game you would have been in an environment like a arcade where you drop a quarter in, whatever, and you can physically play the game as if it is a stand-up game. And of course, the R36S is a console like the Game Boy, let's say a GBA. That's the most, I guess, it looks more like a Game Boy Advanced or something like that. And, that provides you a very simple interface to the MAME games, the MAME 2003 games, which I'm looking at MAME 2003 right here. And there's 1,900 games inside of the MAME 2003 emulator. PlayStation has 189 games, the Dreamcast 25 games, Nintendo 64 324 games, Nintendo 3 games, Game Boy 490 94 games. Yeah, lots and lots of games in each one. Now, mind you, some of these are Chinese versions of the games, or, let's say, not necessarily American releases of the games.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of them are Japanese, some of them are Chinese and stuff like that. And so the thing we're going to wrap up here with is legality. We've not talked about the actual binaries that power the games that the emulators run. In most cases, they're called ROMs. They're literally chunks of read-only memory that are stored in zip files, and those are what the emulators read. And in pretty much 100% of cases, those ROMs are licensed. They're not open source. And the only way you can technically legally use them is if you actually have the game board that has the physical ROMs on it. So you have to consult your conscience about whether you're going to do any of this. I haven't heard of anybody being roughed up or incarcerated or anything like that for having the ROMs. And things like the R36S come with the ROMs installed. I have to imagine that none of them are actually licensed. So technically the whole thing is illegal. And yeah, Dan also brings up the fact that some of the more modern consoles require actual BIOSes because they're literally like virtual machines. For example, the Atari 5200 requires BIOSes. The Intellivision requires a BIOS. The ones that are similar to computers, where they actually boot up and then load cartridges, will require BIOSes. Of course, there's information on how to obtain and how to configure your emulators to use the BIOSes and the ROMs if you get that far. But again, just something to keep in mind that if you play any of these retro games and you don't actually own the game, you are most likely breaking some law somewhere. It hardly stops anybody from doing it, but it's there and something to consider. So, and Bill just disappeared and came back.
No, it's me. It's like every time I want to take a picture of my screen,
it swaps you out.
And when I put it in the chat, it like breaks me out. Yeah, because I can't take a picture with my computer I'm actually recording with. So, I have to say the R36S is an interesting investment, minus the legality side of things, just because it's so cheap. And it provides so much, and it requires absolutely no work for the end user to actually get involved with this retro gaming thing. And I think a lot of the games that you have out there, like there's a big question on licensing. And think about you played, let's say if you've been around gaming for a long time and you played original NES and you played the games there like Contra and stuff like that, those games just die. They die without the ability to play those games. You know that you've blown air so many times on those console cartridges that they no longer run and everything else. But maybe you have a bug to play Contra from 20, 30 years ago, whatever that was.
Pushing 50 now. So
yeah. It's a long time ago, and the ability for you to play that is pretty interesting. I've kind of gotten caught up in the emulator just because, there's just games I remember playing even on the Game Boy Black and White, because that's like the first little miniature console that I actually owned. I remember in college playing Tetris on that with a connector cable with my friend. We'd have the cable between our Game Boys in our college mathematics class, because we both didn't need to be in that mathematics class, but we had to take it because it's a requirement. And we would sit there on the Game Boys, and we'd be playing Tetris for basically the entire class, stacking against each other, throwing lines against him. He threw lines against me. But the ability to actually go back and relive those games that, I mean, I don't have a Game Boy anymore. I don't even know where my original Game Boy is. I think these old emulators they're not old emulators, but yeah, whatever. Emulators for the old games are a way to continue to allow these games to live in the present. And I don't know. I mean, I think that's an invaluable thing for us as a gaming culture, especially for the generation that grew up in gaming that really wants to re-experience these things and see these things, be able to see these in an environment in which we can emulate and see them and maybe even share them with, future generations and stuff like that, because frankly, there's just no other mechanism for that, regardless of legality. It's not like Game Boy or Nintendo is releasing original Game Boy games and recoloring them and sending them out. They're just on to the new stuff. So, I'm really questioning the legality of these games that sort of have died because there's no other mechanism for them to be in the public face anymore.
No, I agree, and I think at this point, these are games that are 40 years old, and it's not like they're coming back. People like to play them, and the only way that you can do it is with an emulator. And I think the companies that own these games, like Atari and Taito and Stern and all of them, Nintendo and whatever, should really relax their tight grip on the IP, because it's not like they're going to be recreating these games or re-releasing them or anything. But as of now, it's still technically an issue. Although I think it's one of those unenforced/unenforceable things. So. But he kind of got to let it out there that it's a thing to be to keep in mind, I guess. But yeah, lots of people do it, and of course, some of these old games they're being re-released like as stand-up arcade machines, and they cost multiple thousands of dollars just for a couple of games, and it just seems silly. I don't know who's buying those, but you really should stop. So.
Yeah, because I remember buying not buying, but like having emulators on my Dreamcast for previous systems like Atari and whatnot built into the Dreamcast system. And then being able to play like, Dig Dug and, whatever the...
Oh yeah, we have an emulator pack that fits on the bottom of a Nintendo GameCube, and it allows you to play Game Boy Advance games on it.
Yeah, but you have to have the ROMs, right?
Yeah, you do have to have the cartridges. Yep. So, well, I mean, I still have a bunch of stuff. I still have some NESs. I have a PS1. I have a GameCube. I've got. I know where my Cheryl's actually Game Boy is. Original Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance. We have all of those. So
yeah, there's a lot of games out there like you may personally own that may already be available out there via emulator and environment that may or may not, legally be licensable for you to play. But like if you actually have the game or you have previously bought the game, I think it's probably safe, right?
I believe so. If you actually own the game in its original form, you are technically licensed to use it. So
yeah, so I'm interested, like especially since I'm acquiring this R36S, like I haven't really tried adding all of my Dreamcast games to it, which I have, a plethora of Dreamcast games in various discs and whatnot. And I haven't gone through that process of actually trying to take one of those games and add it to it. But in theory, you can, which is really compelling because you have a dying platform that may or may not be available for current play. Especially like think about current TVs. How many TVs can you actually plug a game like a Nintendo to? Even my TV upstairs doesn't even have composite ends anymore. So right. You can't even plug anything into the goddamn TV. You have to I have to find another TV that actually has composite ends to play the game. And I think this is a definite mechanism for you to be able to play these games that are no longer available to current technology.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Well, I think that's all we need to talk about this, unless, some questions come up. I'll be glad to answer them if I missed anything. Of course.
So what's the best of breed? Like if you were to build a retro system, should you build one specifically for a Pi system and then use a retro Pi, or would you recommend using, like, let's say, Ubuntu, like we have a new release now, 2404, and then loading up Dolphin and Retro whatever, and then loading your games on there to your current system.
I mean,
or
the easiest way to do it, as far as I'm concerned, is to get a Raspberry Pi, plug it into it, hang it off the back of an HDMI monitor, get a USB interface controller, and just use RetroPie. It is by far the easiest to get running and to boot up and use. And if you use the Raspberry Pi OS installer utility thing that they have now, RetroPie is one of the options. So it'll just download and install it for you. You put the SD card in, hang it off the back of an HDMI monitor. Get your controller, and you just go. You've got all the stuff you need.
So just be mindful of the SD card. Those don't last very long. So if you don't want to disappoint your kids with their save games and whatnot, make sure you rotate those in and out quite often because they're not made for high contention writes.
Or just hang a USB drive off to it and just use that for the games.
Yeah, if you can, that's the best way. If you can actually do a real physical drive, even if it's NVMe or what have you. But the SD cards themselves, like let's say that are on the R36S, you want to replace those quite often and ensure that they're copied over and stuff.
Yep, absolutely. All right, well, that's enough about retro gaming for tonight, I think. We got a few more things to get to before we wrap up the show. And let's see, do you want to do any of these announcements? Oh, by the way, and all the stuff that we talked about, all the different consoles, controllers, interfaces, what have you, everything is going to be linked in the show notes. So you should be able to find everything you need. And I have been doing this for a while, so if you have any particular questions and you want to get into retro gaming, shoot me an email and I will help you out.
Excellent. Yeah, I can go over the announcements and feedback if you want.
All right. If you want to do the 3 bits of feedback there, and I'll talk about the fourth thing.
Okay. Yeah. So our announcements and feedback, we have the first one is a comment from episode 540 from John, KC5NGX. And he says, good podcast. That's for the Ubuntu 24 update. So yeah, thank you. We're working on that right now. Russ and I were just talking earlier today about the build scripts and just trying to refine those. I was working on the Xubuntu build, the XFCE build, and just kind of going through the steps and trying to find any pitfalls within the context of the ability to run the script while the system is real versus a cubic system, which cubic is what we use to build the ISO images. So I was hoping to have a script that works as well after the fact. Let's say you download your favorite Ubuntu ISO and use it, but whether the script will work. So we're still finalizing that and getting everything prettified and working on that. So you can have a functional system in 2404 even without using our exact ISO. So this is really good. So thank you, John, for listening to the podcast and thanking us for the Ubuntu 2404 update. As well, we have a Discord comment from Steve, KJ5T. Thanks, Steve. He says, great topic on the show this week. I've never done top band from the home station and only from a big gun station with full-size 160 vertical and beverage antennas. Once I finish worked all states on 80, maybe I'll experiment with practical 160 antennas. So for those of you that didn't participate or listen to the last podcast, we talked our random topic wheel suggested that we talk about practical top band antennas, which of course is 160 antennas. And we sort of delved into various incarnations of simple antennas that you can work with wire, including inverted L's, half wave, fed antennas. So the typical 9-in-1 end-fed antennas, end-fed half-wave antennas, and the various lengths that allow you to work top band with some success. they're not perfect antennas. They're practical antennas, and practical, is definitely in quotes, because these are simple antennas that you can actually squeak a signal out on and compete in a contest or get some worked all states activity going. Good information in that. There's tons and tons of information you can find online for building a 160 antenna for your backyard, whether that be a very shortened antenna or, if you happen to have a lot of space, a large antenna. But there's a lot of practicality that you can use for any antenna to get on 160 and participate in an effort where there's a lot of people listening that can help you get those contacts, and you can move forward on the 160 or top band antennas. So thank you, Steve, for mentioning that. As well, we have a Facebook comment from Tom, N4HHI. He says, can't wait to see you all at Dayton. I've been listening in every Sunday night, but hopefully listen live tomorrow night and speculations on new gear. Well, yeah. Russ and I are both operating on gear from years ago. Although we have bought some new radios since then, but I would still say that all of our equipment is slightly dated and still works on all the amateur radio bands. But we're very excited to be at Hamvention, as we are every year for the last at least 10 or 11 Hamventions that have been in existence. We will definitely be there in Building 5004 is our official booth number, but most of you know you can come to the Hertz booth, building 5, and you'll find us just entering in from the normal entrance, and we're off to the right. So definitely come see us. We will be there. We would love to talk to you, and love to, especially those of you that don't participate in the live chat or anything else, but want to talk to us about Linux and want to talk to us about getting your ham PC or your PC ham radio ready. We will definitely be there to talk to you about that. In general, by the end of the day, we can no longer talk because our voices are so destroyed because we've been talking so much. I love Hamvention because it's like we get an experience of talking to so many people that are not only listeners, but people that have never even heard of us, and they expect us to be selling something there at the booth. And we're like, well, we're not selling anything. You can download all this stuff for free, and we'll tell you exactly how to do that. Not only that, we'll also provide you with the ability to copy an ISO image so you can try out Linux on your home PC. Although those of you in the 32-bit land, well, those days are numbered and over.
Yeah. Although there's still some distros that are hanging on. So, all right. So the last thing here I wanted to talk about just for a minute was a comment on AI art. In the last episode, there was some feedback on Mastodon, someone telling me to stop using AI art. And apparently there was more to this story than just that. It wasn't just some random comment. Apparently what the issue is Mastodon.radio, which is the federation that I'm using for Linux in the Ham Shack, has been kicking around the idea of banning AI artwork on the platform. So I just wanted to say my little piece about AI artwork. I know everyone has an opinion about AI art and about AI in general, and about ML and all that. I think the issue seems to be that people think that AI is stealing from artists and from the world at large because of the model that it has to use to train itself. That, it goes through like all of the web and looks at all of the pictures and looks at all the things in order to determine what something actually is in order to recreate it in an AI format. Personally, I'm just going to say it. I think that's bullshit, because if you use that logic, then reading a book about paintings is infringing on somebody's copyright, because then you could recreate something that looks like it's in the style of some famous, painter like Rembrandt or whatever. And just reading is stealing from the author. And if an AI can't be trained by just being shown pictures, it's not like it's recreating those things exactly. It's using them as a framework, and human beings and actual wetware uses the exact same framework to learn, to grow, and to recreate things. I don't consider it theft. I consider it a modernization. I understand AI has issues. It has problems. And it's a thing that we definitely need to be concerned about and regulate and all that. But the idea that it's theft to me is ridiculous. I'm open to people, coming at me and telling me why my position is wrong, and I will certainly consider those things. But as of now, I think it's ridiculous. But again, if someone has a decent argument they want to try and sway me with, feel free to send it my way and we can have a discussion.
And we have a couple of comments in the chat room here, like W4DPE says, humans can opt out via copyright and lawsuit if needed for a situation where the work is copied, but no artist or other kind of creator has a way to opt out of the learning model used in their content. And that's very true. And we had a couple comments on the hamvention topic. Steve said, I will not try to bother y'all too much at the booth, but we'll come back and say hi for sure. Please bother us 24/7. It's fine. I'm only picking about our voices just because, we do talk a lot, and literally that's what we're there for, is to talk a lot. So please destroy our voices by the end of the day. If we're not hoarse by the end of the day, we haven't done our job. And Darren says he would love to come, but it's not on the horizon. Darren, we'd love you to come. And one day we'll be coming to WA and
yep,
doing something over there where we can visit with you. I would love to see your home farm and the stuff you're doing with the EMS and stuff like that over in WA. It's very exciting. That's one part of Australia I've never been to, is Western Australia.
Well, I've never been to any part of it, so I would love to come. All right. Well, with that, let's get down to the new subscriber, supporters, and live participants. And for new subscribers, we do have one, John, KC5NGX. Thanks, John. Really appreciate you subscribing.
Woo-woo.
On Facebook, we had Herman Sprogels, David Sandness, Andy Reinhart, and 13 others. Nobody on Twitter, YouTube. On Discord, we had Josh, KE9AHV, and John, KC5NGX. Nobody on Instagram. On Mastodon, we had at DigiEDU, at K4HCK, and at KC4GIA. Thanks, everybody. On the mailing list, we had Steven, W2WF, and Mike, finally getting with the program, I guess, K6GTE, joining the mailing list. And tonight in the live chat, we had Tony, K4XSS, Jill, K1TTZ, Ted, WA0EIR, Steve, KJ5T, Darren, VK6EK, and Dan, W4DPE. Now, I don't think I missed anybody, so.
I haven't seen anybody new. I did see, I want to do an aside.
Okay.
Only because I have recently, following podcasts and announcements and stuff like that, I know Kale from the Ham Radio 360 is restarting something, and I'm sure the chat room can probably refine that a little bit. But I just want to say that the Ham Radio 360, even though I have a nice little cap from them, is not a pioneer in ham radio podcasting, considering they started in 2014. When did we start here at Linux and the Ham Shack?
2008.
2008. So October 2008. So when you want to talk about pioneers in the ham radio podcasting, around specific ham radio topics, and in our topic that we love so much, which is open source and free and open source software, we have been around for quite a while.
This is a true statement. So, all right, with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap this one up. We want to thank everybody for listening. Thank everybody for joining in on the live show with us tonight. We really appreciate that. And Hamvention is coming up so fast now, so we're looking forward to seeing everybody out there. It's going to be a lot of fun. Drive safely. We'll see you. And we'll be back in a week's time with another episode, so tune in for that. And with that, we'll go ahead and get on out of here and wrap this one up. So for the on assignment, Cheryl, W5MOO, got the call sign right this time. We're going to wrap up this episode, 543 of Linux in the Ham Shack. I'm Russ, K5TUX.
And I'm Bill, NA4RD73.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Linux in the Ham Shack. LHS is a community-sponsored podcast. Live recordings are Sunday nights at 8 o'clock Central Time. Our homepage can be found at lhspodcast.info. You can support the podcast via Patreon at patreon.com/LHS Podcast. We're also on Discord, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube and Mastodon. Contact us via email at info@lhspodcast.info or via voicemail at 190954777469. That's 1909 LHS Show. We also have merch. So until next we meet, remember to always heed your hedonism.